The sound of air hissing from four punctured tires filled the morning silence as Sheriff Corinne stepped out of her patrol car, standing in the middle of my front yard. Her face twisted with rage as she stared down at the metal spikes protruding from beneath my carefully replanted grass. For 6 months, she had driven through my lawn whenever she pleased, laughing at my complaints and threatening me with arrest if I dared to challenge her again. But now, as she reached for her radio with shaking hands, I knew the tables had finally turned. Because what she did not realize was that I had spent weeks researching every property law in the state, and those spikes were completely legal. I never thought a patch of grass could change my life, but when I moved to Millbrook 3 years ago, that front lawn became everything to me. Every Saturday morning, I was out there with my mower, cutting perfect diagonal lines across the emerald surface. Every evening after work, I would walk the edges with my trimmer, making sure not a single blade grew beyond its designated border. The neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Henderson from across the street would wave from her porch and call out compliments about how green my grass looked. The mailman started taking a longer route just to walk past the house and admire the work. Even my teenage nephew admitted it looked pretty good when he visited last summer. I had never been the type of person who cared much about appearances. Back in the city, I lived in apartments with no yard at all. But something about owning that small piece of earth, about nurturing it from brown patches to thick carpet, filled me with a pride I had never experienced before. The lawn was proof that I could build something beautiful with my own hands. Spring was the best season. I would wake up before dawn to adjust the sprinkler system, watching the water catch the early sunlight as it arced across the grass. The smell of wet earth and growing things would fill the air as I walked barefoot across the soft surface, checking for any signs of disease or damage that needed attention. My weekends revolved around lawn care. Friday evening was for fertilizing. Saturday morning was for mowing. Sunday afternoon was for edging and cleanup. The routine gave structure to my life in a way that felt comfortable and purposeful. Other people went to bars or took weekend trips. I found my peace in the simple rhythm of maintaining something that was entirely mine. The lawn became my meditation, my therapy, my small corner of perfection in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. When work stress built up during the week, I knew I could come home and lose myself in the methodical care of those few hundred square feet of grass. The physical work cleared my head, and the visible results gave me a sense of accomplishment that my office job never provided. By the end of my second year in Millbrook, people started referring to my house as the one with the beautiful lawn. Real estate agents would drive potential buyers past my property as an example of how nice the neighborhood could look. I overheard conversations at the grocery store where residents mentioned my yard as a source of community pride. That lawn represented more than just grass to me. It was proof that I belonged in Millbrook, that I had contributed something positive to the community, that I had found my place in this small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The time and effort I invested showed in every perfectly trimmed edge and every lush green section. I never imagined that something so peaceful and innocent could become the center of a conflict that would change everything about my life in this town. The first time I saw the tire tracks, I thought there had been some kind of emergency. Two deep ruts carved through the center of my lawn, cutting ugly brown scars across the grass I had spent months perfecting. The tracks ran from the street straight across my property to the sidewalk on the other side, as if someone had decided my yard was a convenient shortcut. I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee mug trembling in my hand, staring at the damage. The morning dew made the torn grass glisten like an open wound. All those hours of careful seeding and watering, all that pride in creating something beautiful, ruined in a few seconds by someone who clearly had no respect for other people's property. My first instinct was to assume it had been an accident. Maybe an ambulance or fire truck had needed to get somewhere quickly, and my lawn was the only way through. Emergency vehicles had the right to cross private property in life-or-death situations, and I could understand that. I was angry about the damage, but I was not unreasonable. But when I walked out to examine the tracks more closely, nothing about the situation made sense. The tire marks were too narrow for an ambulance or fire truck. They looked like they came from a regular car or maybe a police cruiser. And there was no obvious emergency that would have required someone to drive through my yard instead of using the perfectly good street that ran right in front of my house. I spent the rest of that morning taking photographs of the damage from different angles and trying to figure out what kind of vehicle could have made those specific tire tracks. The depth of the ruts suggested something heavy, and the width indicated a standard patrol car or similar vehicle. A sick feeling started to grow in my stomach as I realized what that might mean. The next day, I drove to the sheriff's office to file a report and ask if they knew anything about the incident. The building was a small, outdated structure that smelled like stale coffee and old paperwork. Sheriff Karen Miller sat behind a metal desk covered with forms and manila folders, barely looking up when I walked in. "I need to report property damage," I said, setting my photographs on her desk. "Someone drove through my front lawn yesterday, and I was hoping you might know if it was related to some kind of emergency response." Sheriff Karen glanced at the photos for maybe 3 seconds before pushing them back toward me. "Looks like tire tracks," she said with a shrug. "Could have been anybody." "But I thought maybe if one of your officers had to respond to something in the area, you might have a record of it," I continued, trying to keep my voice calm and respectful. "The damage is pretty significant, and I just want to understand what happened." She finally looked up at me with an expression that made me feel like I was wasting her time. "Listen, pal, cars drive through yards all the time. Kids, drunk drivers, people who take a wrong turn. Unless you saw who did it, there is not much we can do about it." "So you are saying none of your officers were in that area yesterday morning?" I asked. "I am saying we do not keep track of every place our cars drive," she replied, her tone growing colder. "Maybe you should focus on fixing your grass instead of trying to blame the police for your problems." I left that office feeling confused and dismissed, but still hoping this was just a misunderstanding that would not happen again. The second set of tire tracks appeared exactly 1 week later. Same pattern, same route across my lawn, same disregard for the hours I spent trying to repair the damage from the first incident. This time, I knew it was not a coincidence. I started keeping a detailed log of every incident. Date, time, weather conditions, description of the tire tracks, photographs from multiple angles. Within 3 weeks, I had documented 5 separate occasions when someone had driven through my property, always following the same path from street to sidewalk. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The tracks always appeared on weekday mornings between 6 and 7 a.m., when most people were getting ready for work and not looking out their windows. The vehicle always took the exact same route, suggesting someone who was familiar with the layout of my yard and knew exactly where they wanted to go. I started waking up earlier and positioning myself by the front window with my camera, hoping to catch whoever was doing this in the act. For 2 weeks, I saw nothing but empty streets and early morning joggers. But on a Thursday morning in late April, I finally got my answer. Sheriff Karen Miller's patrol car turned onto my street just after 6:30 a.m., moving slowly as if she was looking for something. I grabbed my camera and crouched behind the curtains, heart pounding as I watched her approach my house. Instead of continuing down the street like any normal patrol, she turned sharply and drove straight across my lawn. I could see her face clearly through the windshield as she passed directly in front of my window. She was not responding to an emergency. She was not chasing a suspect or rushing to help someone in trouble. She was driving through my yard deliberately, casually, as if my property was her personal roadway. The worst part was the expression on her face. She looked bored, almost annoyed, like driving through my lawn was a minor inconvenience she had to deal with as part of her day. There was no urgency, no emergency justification, no reason at all except that she felt like doing it. I took photographs of her car, her license plate, the fresh tire tracks she left behind. My hands were shaking as I documented everything, but I forced myself to be thorough and methodical. This was evidence of deliberate harassment by a law enforcement officer, and I needed to make sure I had proof of what was happening. Over the next month, I witnessed Sheriff Karen drive through my lawn 6 more times. Sometimes she would do it multiple times in the same week. Once, she drove through twice in the same day, as if she was testing to see how far she could push things before I would react. The psychological effect was worse than the physical damage. Every morning, I would wake up and immediately check the window to see if my lawn had been violated again. I found myself losing sleep, lying awake listening for the sound of tires on grass. The sanctuary I had created became a source of constant anxiety and anger. My beautiful lawn was turning into a muddy mess of tire ruts and dead grass. The neighbors stopped complimenting my landscaping and started giving me sympathetic looks instead. Mrs. Henderson asked if I was having car trouble because she kept seeing vehicles in my yard. I was too embarrassed to explain that the sheriff was deliberately destroying my property for no reason I could understand. The worst realization was that Sheriff Karen seemed to enjoy what she was doing. I caught her smirking as she drove past my window one morning, as if she found my frustration amusing. This was not just property damage. This was psychological warfare conducted by someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that filing complaints against the sheriff herself would require careful planning and undeniable evidence. Armed with photographs, dates, and detailed documentation, I returned to the sheriff's office to file a formal complaint. This time, I was prepared for Sheriff Karen's dismissiveness, but I was not prepared for her outright hostility. "You again," she said when I walked through the door. "What is your problem now?" I placed a folder full of evidence on her desk, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "I have documented 14 separate incidents of your patrol car driving through my property without permission. This constitutes criminal trespass and property damage, and I want to file formal charges." Sheriff Karen opened the folder and glanced through my carefully organized photographs and written reports. Her expression grew darker with each page she turned. When she finished, she looked up at me with barely controlled anger. "Are you accusing me of something?" she asked, her voice low and threatening. "I am reporting criminal activity that I have witnessed and documented," I replied. "The fact that the person committing these crimes happens to be a law enforcement officer does not make it legal." She stood up from her chair and walked around the desk until she was standing directly in front of me, using her height and uniform to intimidate. "Listen very carefully," she said. "If you continue to harass me with these ridiculous accusations, I will arrest you for filing false police reports and interfering with a police officer in the performance of her duties." "What duties?" I asked. What possible law enforcement purpose could there be for driving through my lawn? That is none of your business, she snapped. But if you keep bothering me about this, I will find reasons to make your life very difficult. Do you understand me? I left that office knowing that the local police were not going to help me. Sheriff Karen had made it clear that she considered herself above the law, and she was willing to use her position to threaten anyone who challenged her authority. My next step was to contact the state police, hoping that an outside agency might be willing to investigate corruption in the local sheriff's department. I spent hours on the phone, being transferred from one department to another, explaining my situation to officers who sounded increasingly uninterested as the conversation continued. "Have you tried talking to your city council?" one state trooper asked. "Property disputes are usually handled at the local level." "This is not a property dispute," I explained. "This is criminal trespass and abuse of power by a law enforcement officer." "But you said she is the sheriff, right? So she would be the one to investigate criminal activity in your town." The circular logic was maddening. The person committing crimes was the same person responsible for investigating crimes, and no one seemed to understand why that was a problem. I contacted the mayor's office, the city council, and even the county commissioners. Each official I spoke with gave me the same response. They were sure there was some misunderstanding. Sheriff Karen was a respected member of the community, and perhaps I should try to work things out with her directly. The most frustrating conversation was with Mayor Thompson, who had known Sheriff Karen's family for decades and could not believe she would do anything inappropriate. "Karen is a good person," he insisted. "Her father was sheriff before her and her grandfather before that. The Miller family has been protecting this town for 3 generations. I am sure if you just talk to her reasonably, you can resolve this situation." "I have talked to her," I said. "She threatened to arrest me for filing complaints about her criminal behavior." "That does not sound like the Karen Miller I know," he replied. "Are you sure you are not misunderstanding something about police procedures?" The conversation ended with Mayor Thompson promising to look into the situation, but I never heard from him again. It became clear that Sheriff Karen's family connections and political relationships made her untouchable through official channels. Even more disturbing was the social pressure I began to face from other residents. Word spread quickly in a small town, and people started treating me like a troublemaker who was causing problems for a respected law enforcement officer. Former friends began avoiding me at the grocery store. My neighbor stopped waving when I worked in my yard. The message was clear. Challenging Sheriff Karen meant challenging the established power structure of the entire community, and that was not acceptable behavior for someone who wanted to fit in. The incident that changed everything happened on a Saturday afternoon in June. I was hosting a family barbecue for my nephew's graduation, with relatives who had driven from 3 different states to celebrate. We had tables set up on the back patio, children running around the yard, and everyone was having a wonderful time when Sheriff Karen's patrol car turned onto my street. I watched through the kitchen window as she approached my house, hoping she would drive past like any normal patrol car would. But instead, she slowed down and made direct eye contact with me through the window. Then, with deliberate precision, she turned and drove straight across my front lawn while my entire family was watching. The conversation on the patio stopped mid-sentence as everyone turned to stare at the police car, cutting deep ruts through my grass. Children pointed and asked their parents why the police officer was driving through our yard. My elderly aunt asked if there was some kind of emergency happening that we needed to know about. I walked outside to confront Sheriff Karen, as she completed her pass through my property and stopped her car on the sidewalk. She rolled down her window with a smug expression that made my blood boil. "Is there some kind of emergency?" I asked, loud enough for my family to hear. "Just doing my job," she replied with a shrug, "making sure the neighborhood is safe." "Your job requires you to drive through private property in front of my family." "My job requires me to patrol wherever I think I need to patrol," she said. "And if you do not like it, maybe you should move somewhere else." She drove away, leaving me standing in my ruined lawn while my relatives watched in stunned silence. The humiliation was complete. After months of trying to handle this situation quietly and professionally, Sheriff Karen had chosen the most public and embarrassing way possible to demonstrate that she could do whatever she wanted to me and my property. My nephew's graduation party was ruined. Instead of celebrating his achievement, we spent the rest of the afternoon explaining to confused relatives why the local sheriff was harassing us. The questions were endless and the answers were inadequate. How do you explain to your family that you are being targeted by corrupt law enforcement and there is nothing you can do about it? That night, after everyone went home, I sat alone in my living room staring at the fresh tire tracks in my front yard. The lawn that had once been my pride and joy now looked like a battlefield. 6 months of harassment had destroyed not just the grass, but my sense of security and belonging in this community. I realized that Sheriff Karen had won. She had successfully isolated me from the community, made me look like a troublemaker, and demonstrated that she could violate my property rights whenever she felt like it. The system that was supposed to protect citizens from abuse of power had instead protected the abuser and silenced the victim. But as I sat there in the dark, something inside me shifted. The despair and helplessness began to transform into something harder and more focused. If the system would not protect me, then I would have to protect myself. If Sheriff Karen wanted to play games with my property, then I would change the rules of the game. I spent that night researching property rights and defensive measures that homeowners could legally employ to protect their land. I read about retractable spike systems designed to prevent unauthorized vehicles from entering private driveways. I studied court cases where property owners had successfully defended their right to install defensive landscaping features. The more I read, the more I realized that Sheriff Karen had made a critical mistake. In her arrogance and abuse of power, she had created a legal situation where I had the right to take defensive action to protect my property. Her pattern of trespassing was so well documented that any reasonable court would consider defensive measures justified. By dawn, I had a plan. It was risky, potentially expensive, and would probably escalate the conflict to a whole new level. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over the situation. Sheriff Karen had spent 6 months teaching me that the system would not protect me from her abuse. Now I was going to teach her that actions have consequences, even for people who think they are above the law. The victim was about to become the hunter. My research into property defense systems led me deep into the world of commercial security equipment. I discovered that retractable tire spike systems were commonly used by parking lots, gated communities, and private businesses to prevent unauthorized vehicle access. The systems were completely legal when installed on private property, with proper signage and reasonable defensive purpose. The key was finding a system that would activate only under the weight of a vehicle, remaining hidden beneath the grass until someone drove over it. I spent weeks comparing different models, reading technical specifications, and studying installation requirements. The system I finally selected was designed for residential driveways and could be easily concealed beneath existing landscaping. The spike strips were made of hardened steel with retractable points that would puncture tires, but automatically reset after the vehicle passed over them. The mechanism was triggered by pressure plates that could be adjusted for different weight thresholds. Most importantly, the system included clear warning signs that could be posted to notify people that the area was protected by vehicle barriers. Ordering the equipment required careful planning. I could not have it delivered to my house where neighbors might see the delivery truck and ask questions. Instead, I had it shipped to my workplace and transported it home in sections over several weekends, storing everything in my garage while I prepared for installation. The installation had to be done at night when no one would see me digging up sections of my lawn. I waited for a week with no moon and clear weather forecast, then began the most important landscaping project of my life. Working by the light of a small flashlight, I carefully removed sections of grass and soil along the exact path that Sheriff Corinne always used when driving through my property. The spike system required precise measurements and level ground to function properly. Each pressure plate had to be positioned exactly right to ensure that the spikes would deploy at the correct angle and depth to puncture tires without causing excessive damage to the vehicle itself. I was not trying to create a death trap, just a consequence for illegal trespassing. The most challenging part was concealing the system beneath the grass. The pressure plates had to be flush with the ground surface and completely invisible to someone driving over them. I spent hours adjusting the height and camouflaging the edges with dirt and grass seed. By the time I finished, even I had trouble seeing exactly where the system was installed. I planted warning signs at both ends of my property, clearly stating that the area was protected by vehicle deterrent devices and that unauthorized vehicles entered at their own risk. The signs were legally required and would protect me from liability claims, but I positioned them where they would be visible to pedestrians without being obvious to someone driving quickly through the area. The final step was testing the system to make sure it worked properly. I borrowed a heavy wheelbarrow from my neighbor and pushed it slowly across the trigger area, watching as the spikes deployed exactly as designed. The points were sharp enough to puncture rubber but retracted immediately once the weight passed over them. The mechanism was smooth, silent, and virtually undetectable. Installing the spike system took 3 nights of careful work, but when I finished, my property was finally protected. The next time Sheriff Corinne decided to drive through my lawn, she would discover that her actions had consequences. The victim had become empowered, and the balance of power was about to shift dramatically. I spent the following days in a state of nervous anticipation, checking the system each morning to make sure it was still functioning properly and waiting for Sheriff Corinne's next violation of my property. Part of me hoped she would find some other route for her patrols and avoid my lawn entirely, ending this conflict without further escalation. But deep down, I knew that Sheriff Corinne's arrogance would not allow her to change her behavior just because I had complained about it. She had spent months demonstrating her contempt for my property rights and her belief that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. The spike system would test whether she was really as untouchable as she believed. Every morning, I woke up wondering if this would be the day when months of planning and preparation would pay off. The anticipation was almost unbearable, but it was also empowering. For the first time since this conflict began, I held the advantage. Sheriff Corinne had no idea that the rules of engagement had changed, and her next act of trespassing would be her last. It happened on a Tuesday morning at exactly 6:45 a.m. I was positioned at my kitchen window with my camera ready, having maintained this routine for 2 weeks since installing the spike system. Sheriff Corinne's patrol car turned onto my street with the same casual arrogance she had displayed for months, approaching my house like she owned the entire neighborhood. I held my breath as she slowed down and made the familiar turn toward my lawn. She was driving at her usual speed, showing no awareness that anything had changed since her last trespass. Through my telephoto lens, I could see her face clearly, wearing the same bored expression she always had when violating my property rights. The front tires of her patrol car crossed the trigger point for the spike system at exactly the same moment I pressed the shutter button on my camera. What happened next was more dramatic than I had anticipated. Instead of the quiet hiss of air escaping that I expected, there was a series of loud pops as all four tires were punctured simultaneously by the steel spikes. Sheriff Corinne's car lurched to an immediate stop, tilted at an angle as the deflated tires settled onto the rims. The expression on her face transformed from bored confidence to shocked disbelief in the span of about 3 seconds. She gripped the steering wheel and looked around frantically, as if she could not understand what had just happened to her vehicle. I continued taking photographs as she opened the car door and stepped out to examine the damage. When she saw the steel spikes protruding from her shredded tires, her face turned red with rage. She looked directly at my kitchen window and pointed at me, shouting something I could not hear through the glass but could easily understand from her body language. Sheriff Corinne grabbed her radio and called for backup, her voice carrying across the morning air as she demanded immediate assistance and a tow truck. Within minutes, 2 additional patrol cars arrived on the scene, along with a growing crowd of neighbors who had heard the commotion and come out to see what was happening. I watched from my window as Sheriff Corinne gestured wildly at her damaged vehicle and pointed repeatedly toward my house. She was clearly trying to convince the other officers that I had somehow attacked her car, but her story became complicated when Deputy Martinez walked over to examine the spike system. "Corinne, these are pressure-activated tire deflation devices," I heard him say. "They are installed on his private property, and there are warning signs posted at both ends of the lawn." "I do not care what they are," Sheriff Corinne snapped. "He put them there to target police vehicles. This is assault on a law enforcement officer." "But why were you driving through his yard in the first place?" Deputy Martinez asked. The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Sheriff Corinne's face grew even redder as she struggled to come up with an explanation that would not incriminate her for months of illegal trespassing. "I was conducting a patrol," she said weakly. "Through someone's front lawn," Deputy Martinez pressed. "Corinne, you know we cannot just drive through private property without cause." A third officer, Sergeant Williams, had been walking around the spike system and examining the warning signs. "These devices are completely legal," he announced. "The property owner has the right to install vehicle barriers on his own land, especially if he has been having problems with unauthorized vehicles." Sheriff Corinne looked around desperately as she realized that her fellow officers were not going to automatically support her version of events. The crowd of neighbors was growing larger, and people were taking pictures with their phones. What had started as a private conflict was now becoming a very public spectacle. "I want him arrested for interfering with police business," Sheriff Corinne demanded, pointing toward my house. "What police business?" Sergeant Williams asked. "If you were just patrolling, why did you not use the street like everyone else?" The question that no one had been willing to ask for months was finally being asked by her own fellow officers. Sheriff Corinne had no good answer because there was no good answer. Her months of harassment and abuse of power were being exposed in front of the entire neighborhood. I stepped outside with my folder of documentation, including photographs of every previous incident when Sheriff Karen had driven through my property. Deputy Martinez accepted the evidence and spent several minutes reviewing the dates, times, and photographic proof of the harassment pattern. "Karen, we need to talk," Deputy Martinez said quietly. "This gentleman has documented 14 separate incidents of you driving through his property without authorization. That is criminal trespass, and now I understand why he installed defensive measures." The tables had completely turned. Sheriff Karen, who had spent months using her badge to intimidate and threaten me, was now facing questions from her own department about her conduct. The spike system had done more than just puncture her tires. It had punctured her shield of immunity and exposed her crimes to the people who had the power to hold her accountable. The aftermath of the spike incident moved quickly once Sheriff Karen's own department began investigating her pattern of harassment. Deputy Martinez took my documentation seriously and initiated a formal internal affairs review within 24 hours. The photographs and detailed logs I had maintained for months became crucial evidence in establishing that Sheriff Karen had been systematically abusing her authority. The investigation revealed that I was not her only victim. 2 other residents came forward with similar stories of harassment and intimidation by Sheriff Karen, including threats of arrest for filing complaints about her conduct. The pattern that emerged was of a law enforcement officer who believed her badge made her untouchable and used that belief to terrorize citizens who challenged her authority. Sheriff Karen was suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation. The department issued a public statement acknowledging that my defensive measures were legal and justified, and that no charges would be filed against me for protecting my property. Instead, Sheriff Karen faced potential criminal charges for trespass, abuse of power, and official misconduct. The civil lawsuit came next. My attorney, who had initially been skeptical about taking on a case against law enforcement, became enthusiastic once he saw the quality of evidence I had assembled. The documented pattern of harassment, combined with the department's own internal affairs findings, created a strong case for damages and civil rights violations. Sheriff Karen's insurance company settled out of court for an amount that covered all the damage to my lawn, my legal expenses, and additional compensation for the months of psychological harassment I had endured. More importantly, the settlement included an admission that her conduct had been inappropriate and illegal. The community reaction was mixed, but generally supported my actions once the full story became public. Many residents expressed surprise and disappointment that their sheriff had been abusing her authority, while others appreciated that someone had finally stood up to corruption in local law enforcement. My neighbors who had previously avoided me began apologizing for their earlier coldness and expressing respect for my persistence in fighting back. The spike system was removed once the legal proceedings concluded, but not before several other residents inquired about installing similar protective measures on their own properties. Apparently, Sheriff Karen's harassment had been more widespread than anyone realized, and my successful resistance had encouraged others to come forward with their own stories. Sheriff Karen resigned from her position rather than face criminal prosecution, relocating to another state where her history of misconduct was not widely known. The Miller family's 3-generation legacy of law enforcement in Millbrook ended in disgrace, replaced by a new sheriff who emphasized community policing and accountability. My lawn eventually recovered from months of abuse and neglect. The grass grew back thicker and greener than before, as if it was celebrating its liberation from systematic destruction. I returned to my weekend routine of mowing and trimming, but now the work carried additional satisfaction beyond simple maintenance. Every perfectly edged border was a reminder that ordinary citizens could fight back against abuse of power and win. The most important lesson I learned was that documentation and persistence could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. By methodically recording every incident and refusing to be intimidated by threats, I had created an undeniable record of misconduct that could not be ignored or dismissed. The system that had initially protected Sheriff Karen was eventually forced to hold her accountable when the evidence became overwhelming. Looking back, I realized that the conflict had changed me in ways that went beyond just protecting my property. I had discovered that I was capable of standing up to authority figures who abused their power, even when that meant facing social isolation and potential retaliation. The experience taught me that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to take extraordinary risks. My lawn was beautiful again, but more importantly, my community was free from a corrupt sheriff who had terrorized residents for years. The spikes had done their job not just by puncturing tires, but by puncturing the myth that badges make people untouchable. In the end, the system worked, but only after one citizen refused to accept injustice and fought back with patience, documentation, and legal defensive measures. The rule of law had been restored, one spike at a time,